You count people for a living. Not cattle, not sacks of grain. People. A ship comes in low and slow, and before the ropes are even tied to the stone bollards, your hand is already reaching for the ledger. You write a number. The number has a price attached to it. The price changes depending on the teeth, the back, the scars, the age, the hands. You have learned to read a human body the way other men read weather. You did not choose to learn this. It chose you the day you learned your letters, and no other door was open. There is a square not far from where you work. In the middle of it stands a stone pillar, white marble, worn smooth at the base by rope. People are tied to it. People are whipped against it. You have seen it from the window of the customs house more times than you can count, which is strange because counting is the one thing you are good at. A boy comes off a ship one morning, with his wrists rubbed raw and his eyes fixed on nothing. You write him down as one entry, one line, one number among many. You tell yourself that this is simply the work. Somewhere beyond the harbor mouth, far past the line where the water turns from green to deep blue, there are sails gathering that no one in this town can see yet. By the time anyone understands what those sails mean, the ledgers you have spent years filling will be nothing but ash drifting over a burned square. A senior clerk leans over your shoulder one evening and tells you, quietly, that some of the numbers in last month's count do not add up the way they should. Something settles into place in your chest at that moment, a recognition you did not ask for. The corruption in this town does not only live in the hold of a ship, it lives in the ink as well. You learn that some kinds of silence are also a kind of theft. A woman on the docks grips a child's hand so hard that her knuckles go white, and an officer pulls them apart anyway, because the manifest calls for them to be sold separately, and the manifest does not care what her hand is doing. You watch this happen, and you do nothing, because there is nothing in your power to do, and that fact will sit in your chest for the rest of your life. A governor flees inland on a dirt road, leaving a town undefended behind him. Bells are torn down from a cathedral roof and carried away on foreign shoulders. A fire starts in a warehouse stacked with silk, wine, and gunpowder, and by morning, the town where you were born will not exist in the same shape it does tonight. You do not know any of this yet. Tonight, you are 19 years old, and you are walking toward your very first day inside the customs house, and the only thing on your mind is whether your handwriting is steady enough for the work they are about to give you. This is quiet history at bedtime, and if this is your kind of story, a subscribe means everything right now. Every detail in this story comes from the historical record. Just relax and feel free to let this play as you drift off to sleep. Now, let us begin. Your name is Pedro Mendes, and you are 19 years old. You were born in this town, in a small house 2 streets back from the harbor, to a father who arrived from the Algarve coast of Portugal with nothing but a trunk of tools and a hope of land, and a mother whose own family had been on this island for 2 generations already. This makes you what the town calls a branco da terra, a white of the land, which sounds like a privilege until you understand what it actually means in practice. You are not the man who sails in from Lisbon with a royal appointment in his coat pocket. You are not the soldier with a fresh commission or the priest with a bishop's letter behind him. You are something lower than that, something local, something that the men who actually run this colony tend to look past rather than at. What you have, instead of land or rank, is a set of letters in your hand that most men on this island do not possess. The Franciscan friars taught you to read and write inside the cool stone walls of their convent, not out of charity exactly, but because a colony needs scribes more than it needs another farmer scraping a living from dry hillsides. And because your father, before he died of a fever 2 years ago, paid what little he had so that you would have a trade that did not depend on rain. You are not a soldier. You are not a slaver standing on the deck of a ship with a whip coiled at his belt. You are the pen that turns living people into numbers on a page. And once you have learned how to do that well, the men who run this town will not let you walk away from it. This is the work available to a poor, literate, local-born young man in this town, in this decade, and you took it like a drowning man grabbing a rope, without asking too many questions about where the rope leads. To understand why this work even exists here, on a small, dry island in the middle of the Atlantic, you have to understand what this town is. It was not built for fishing or for farming, though men do both here when they can. It was built because of where it sits on a map. 120 years before you were born, a Genoese navigator named Antonio da Noli, sailing under the Portuguese crown, found this stretch of coast on the island of Santiago, where a river valley cuts down to a natural harbor and fresh water runs almost year-round. He and a handful of Portuguese settlers built their town here in this valley and called it Ribeira Grande, the Great River, and it became the very first European town built anywhere in the tropical world. You walk past the cathedral of Nossa Senhora do Rosário most mornings on your way to work. Its stone walls, almost a century old now, the oldest colonial church standing anywhere on earth. And you rarely think about what that means, because to you it is simply the church, the place where you were baptized, the bell that wakes you on feast days. 4 years after the town was founded, the Portuguese crown granted its settlers the right to trade along the coast of West Africa, a stretch the Portuguese call Guinea, running from the Senegal River down through what they call the slave rivers. That right did not stay in the settlers' hands for long. The crown took the most profitable parts of it back for itself within a few years. But by then the pattern of this town's entire existence had already been set in stone, quite literally, in the warehouses and the customs house and the harbor walls built to receive one particular kind of cargo above all others. Ships leave this harbor for the African coast, a few days' sail east, and they come back low in the water, holding men, women, and children captured or purchased inland and marched to the coast in chains. They do not sail directly onward to Brazil or to the Caribbean from there. They stop here first, in this harbor, in this town, because a body that has just survived weeks in a coastal barracoon needs water, food, and time before it can survive the longer crossing of the open Atlantic, and because the men who run this trade need a place to count their merchandise and certify it for sale. This town exists, in large part, to be that place. You know the shape of your own town's society without ever having to think about it, the way your feet know the slope of a familiar street in the dark, because you have lived inside it your entire life. At the very top sit the men sent out from the Portuguese court itself, governors, royal officials, the bishop and his senior clergy, men whose authority comes from a letter sealed in Lisbon rather than from anything they have built here with their own hands. Below them come people like you and your family, the Brancos de Terra, the local-born descendants of the first settlers, people whose grandfathers cleared this land and built these walls, but whose names mean nothing at court. Below you come the free people of mixed African and Portuguese descent, the Pardos, and the free black islanders, the Pretos Foros, some of whom own land, some of whom work trades, all of whom occupy a strange middle ground that shifts depending on who is asking. And at the very bottom, holding up the entire structure the way a foundation holds up a house no one looks at, are the enslaved. When your grandfather's generation first settled this valley, there were perhaps 160 free settlers here and only 30 enslaved people working alongside them. A town small enough that everyone still knew everyone's name. In the years since, the numbers have turned almost entirely upside down. There are now close to 2,000 free residents on this island, and something closer to 14,000 enslaved people living and working within its boundaries, a ratio that tells you, more clearly than any sermon could, exactly what this island has become. You think about that ratio sometimes, late at night, the way you think about a sum that will not balance no matter how many times you check the columns. You arrive at the customs house just as the morning bell finishes ringing, and the building itself looks unremarkable from the outside, a long, low structure of whitewashed stone near the harbor wall, with narrow windows cut to let in light without letting in too much heat. Inside, the air smells of dust, ink, and something underneath both of those things, something like tar and salt and old sweat that never quite airs out no matter how many doors stand open. A man named Mestre Vicente, the senior clerk under whom you have been placed, looks up from a tall standing desk when you enter, and he does not smile exactly, but something in his face softens slightly when he sees you arrive on time. He has been doing this work for 11 years, he tells you, as he walks you down a row of shelves stacked with bound ledgers, their leather covers darkened and cracked from handling. Each ledger covers roughly 1 year of the harbor's trade, he explains, running a finger along the spines, and inside each one is a record of every ship that has entered this port, what it carried, what duties were owed to the crown, and what became of the cargo once it was unloaded. You ask him, carefully, what exactly your duties will involve, and he answers you plainly, the way a man explains a trade rather than a moral position. You will stand at the wharf when ships arrive carrying captives from the coast. You will record the number of people aboard, sorted by age and apparent health, using the units the Crown requires for tax and sale purposes. You will note any deaths during the crossing, since those numbers matter for the ship captain's accounts. You will hand your tally to the officer overseeing the sale, and that tally will become, in effect, the official truth of what arrived that day. He tells you this the same way he might explain how to weigh sacks of salt. You nod, because nodding is what is expected of you, and because you genuinely do not yet know what it will feel like to stand on that wharf with a quill in your hand and a human being in front of you, reduced to a line in a column. Mestre Vicente hands you a fresh quill, already cut, and a small pot of ink, and tells you that tomorrow, when the bell rings for an incoming ship, You will follow him down to the harbor and watch how the count is done before you are trusted to do it yourself. You spend the rest of that first afternoon copying old entries into a new ledger, practicing your hand, making sure your numbers are clean and legible, because Mestre Vicente has told you that a smudged figure can mean the difference between a fair tax and an unfair one, and an unfair tax draws attention from Lisbon that no one in this town wants. Your fingers ache by the end of the day from gripping the quill too tightly, and there is a fine line of ink staining the side of your right hand that will not wash away easily, a mark you will carry in one form or another every working day from now on. You walk home that evening along the harbor wall, past warehouses stacked with barrels of wine and oil waiting to be loaded onto outbound ships, past fishermen hauling in the last of their catch, past the white pillar standing empty in the square for once, no one tied to it tonight. The sky over the water turns the color of a bruise as the sun goes down, orange fading into purple, fading into the deep blue that swallows everything eventually. And somewhere out past the edge of what you can see, ships are already moving toward this harbor that you have not yet learned to dread. You do not know yet how many mornings like this one are still ahead of you, how many tallies, how many faces you will reduce to numbers before this is finished. Tonight, you only know that your hand is sore, your collar smells of ink, and tomorrow, for the first time, you will stand on the wharf and watch a ship come in. The bell that wakes the town the next morning is not the cathedral bell. It is a different bell entirely, sharper, struck 3 times in quick succession from the lookout post above the harbor, and the moment you hear it, even half asleep, your whole body understands what it means before your mind catches up. A ship has been sighted rounding the point. You are out the door before you have properly tied your sash, walking quickly through streets that are already filling with movement, porters heading for the wharf, a priest hurrying toward the customs house with his robes gathered in one fist, 2 soldiers stationed at the harbor gate straightening their posture as the crowd thickens around them. Mestre Vicente is waiting for you exactly where he said he would be, at the foot of the stone steps leading down to the main quay, a leather satchel slung over one shoulder holding spare paper, ink, and a folded cloth he uses to keep his hands clean between entries. He does not waste time on greetings. He simply hands you a second satchel, lighter than his own, and tells you to watch everything, write nothing yet, and ask your questions later, because the count waits for no one, and a distracted clerk makes mistakes that cost the crown money. You stand beside him at the edge of the quay as the ship grows larger against the pale morning sky, its sails slack now that it has caught the harbor's calmer water, its hull riding low, lower than a ship carrying only wine or cloth would ride. That low draft tells you something before the ship has even reached the dock, something Mestre Vicente confirms with a single nod when he sees you notice it. A full hold of human cargo sits heavier in the water than almost anything else a ship might carry, he tells you quietly, because bodies, unlike barrels, cannot be stacked with perfect efficiency, and the crew always loses some weight in space to the simple necessity of keeping enough people alive to reach port at all. You feel your stomach tighten at the practical, almost mathematical way he says this, the same flat tone a man might use to discuss the loading of stone rather than people. This flatness of voice is not cruelty exactly, it is armor. It is what 11 years of standing on this wharf does to a man's tongue. The ship ties off against the stone bollards with a groan of rope and timber, and the smell reaches you before the gangplank is even lowered. A thick, close smell of unwashed bodies, sickness, and salt water that has sat too long in a closed space. You have smelled death before, on this island, in fever season. This is not quite that. It is something adjacent to it, something that makes your eyes water before you understand why. Mestre Vicente does not react to the smell at all, and you force yourself to match his stillness, knowing without being told that your own face is also part of what is being observed this morning, by him, by the officer of the customs house standing further up the quay, by everyone watching to see whether the new clerk can hold steady. The gangplank drops with a heavy wooden slap against the stone, and the ship's captain comes down first, a weathered Portuguese man you do not recognize, his boots and coat far better kept than anything aboard his own vessel. He exchanges a few words with the customs officer, hands over a sealed letter bearing the ship's papers, and steps aside, because the part of the morning that actually concerns him, the part involving money, will happen later, once the count is finished and verified against his own figures. Behind him, the crew begins bringing the captives up from below deck, and this is the part of the morning you have been quietly dreading since you woke to that bell. They come up in a slow line, blinking hard against sunlight they have not seen in weeks, some of them stumbling on legs that have forgotten, in the dark of the hold, how to hold a person's full weight. Sailors with short clubs and coiled rope stand along the line, not striking anyone yet, simply present, the way a fence is present around a field, a reminder rather than an active threat for the moment. Mestre Vicente steps forward with his satchel open and begins, in a low, steady voice, calling out categories that you recognize from your reading the day before. Adult male, sound. Adult female, sound. Child, under 10 years, counted at half value. Elderly, marked separately, often sold at a loss if sold at all. This is the system the Crown itself prescribes for valuing a cargo of this kind, a unit the merchants and officials call a peça da India, a piece of the Indies, a single standardized measure against which every living person on that gangplank is weighed, so that a healthy grown man counts as one whole piece, while 2 children or 1 elderly woman or 1 person marked by visible illness might together or separately be reckoned as some fraction of that same unit. You watch Mestre Vicente's eyes move across each person for only a few seconds before he calls out a category, and you realize he is reading scars, posture, the clarity of someone's eyes, the condition of their teeth, the same way you might read the binding and pages of a book to guess its age and value without opening it. He hands you the quill without looking at you and tells you, quietly, that it is time for you to write down what he calls. Your hand shakes slightly on the first entry, the ink blotting just slightly larger than it should at the start of the word, and you force yourself to breathe slowly and steady your grip, because Mestre Vicente has already told you that an unsteady hand on this wharf is a luxury you are not permitted. A woman near the front of the line is holding a small child against her hip, and when the sailors begin to separate them, intending to count the child apart from her under the rules of the manifest, her grip tightens so hard that her knuckles turn pale even from where you stand. An officer pulls them apart anyway, his hand closing around the child's arm with the same practiced indifference he might use to move a sack of grain from one pile to another. And the woman makes a sound that is not quite a word in any language you know, low and broken, before she goes still again, because stillness, you are beginning to understand, is the only thing that keeps a person from being struck on this wharf. You write the entry: adult female, sound, child under 10, sound. 2 separate lines, 2 separate numbers on the same page, ink drying in the morning heat. Your hand does not shake on this entry. You notice that, and you are not sure yet whether that should frighten you more than the shaking did. By the time the ship is fully unloaded, the sun stands high enough that your shirt is soaked through at the back, and your hand aches from gripping the quill through nearly 2 hours of steady writing, page after page filling with names that are not names, only categories, ages, and conditions, the entire human cargo of one Atlantic crossing, reduced to a column of ink that will be checked, copied, and filed before the day is through. Mestre Vicente closes his satchel, glances over your work with a brief, approving nod at the steadiness of your final entries, and tells you that tomorrow there will likely be another ship, because there is almost always another ship, and that you will need to learn the categories well enough to call them yourself before the month is out. You walk back up from the wharf in the white heat of midday, past the empty pillar in the square, past the cathedral bell tolling for noon prayers, your satchel heavy on your shoulder with pages that will outlive every person whose name should have been written on them but was not. Tonight you will eat in silence at your mother's table, your hand still smelling faintly of ink and salt water, and you will not yet have the words to explain to her what the work actually felt like. Only that it is work, and that you are good at it, and that tomorrow there will be another ship. 6 weeks pass before you stop dreaming about the wharf. By then you have stood beside Mestre Vicente through 4 more ships, and your hand has learned to hold steady through all of them, though something else in you has not quite learned the same trick. You begin to understand that the work you do does not end at the wharf. It only begins there. A ship's cargo, once counted and recorded, does not go straight to sail. The people from that hold are walked, under guard, to a low compound of buildings near the edge of town, where they remain for weeks, sometimes longer, before anyone places a bid. Mestre Vicente calls this period a seasoning, a word he uses without any apparent discomfort, the way he might describe curing a side of meat or drying a length of cloth before it goes to market. During this time, the merchants who own the cargo see to it that everyone is fed enough to recover some of the weight lost at sea, that wounds are tended just enough to prevent infection from spreading and ruining the value of an entire group, and that every single person, before they are sold onward, receives a Catholic baptism. You learn that this baptism is not optional, and it is not in any meaningful sense about faith. It is required under Portuguese law before a person can be legally sold and transported to Brazil or the Caribbean. A single Latin rite performed quickly, often on dozens of people at once, by an overworked priest reciting words that few of those receiving them can understand. You attend one of these mass baptisms in your 2nd month at the customs house, standing at the edge of the small chapel near the seasoning compound, your ledger open on your arm because the crown requires a written record of every baptism alongside every sale. The priest moves down a line of people standing shoulder to shoulder, touching water to each forehead in turn, murmuring the same handful of Latin words over and over until the words themselves seem to lose their shape, becoming pure sound rather than meaning. You write down each name the priest gives them, names chosen on the spot, Portuguese names that have nothing to do with whatever name each person was given at birth. And watching the ink dry, you recognize this too as a kind of erasure performed in the name of mercy. You walk back to the customs house that afternoon, along streets you have walked your entire life, and for the first time you find yourself truly looking at the town you grew up in, the way a stranger might look at it. The Cathedral of Nossa Senhora do Rosário stands at the heart of the town, its bell tower visible from nearly every street, its stones quarried from the hills above the valley and carried down by hands that 2 generations ago likely belonged to enslaved laborers rather than free men. Near the harbor, a Franciscan convent houses the friars who taught you your letters, men who spend their days teaching catechism to the free children of the town, while a few hundred paces away, other men perform mass baptisms on people about to be shipped across an ocean. The market square sits between the two, dominated by the white stone pillar where you have watched people punished, a structure built decades before you were born and already, by the time you came into the world, simply part of the landscape, the way a tree or a well becomes part of a landscape once it has stood long enough. You begin to notice the merchants who move through this town with the easy confidence of men who belong wherever they stand. Genoese traders who arrived generations ago and stayed, Flemish factors managing warehouses full of wine and cloth, and a handful of families whose grandparents, you have heard whispered more than once, fled the Spanish and Portuguese persecution of the Jews nearly a century ago and rebuilt their lives and their trade networks here, on this small, dry island far enough from Lisbon's eye to breathe a little easier. These men deal in everything that passes through this harbor, not only in people, but in the cotton cloth woven on this very island by enslaved women, cloth the islanders call panos, bolts of striped fabric that are themselves loaded onto ships and carried back to the African coast, where they are traded for yet more captives, completing a circle that you are beginning to understand has no real beginning and, as far as you can tell, no end. One of these merchants, a quiet, careful man named Henrique Vaz, whose family has lived on this island for 3 generations, sometimes stops to speak with you at the customs house counter when he comes to file his own manifests, asking after your mother, complimenting the steadiness of your hand on the page in front of him. Market day falls on Saturdays in this town, and you find yourself drawn there more often than your errands strictly require, watching enslaved weavers from the outlying plantations bring finished bolts of panos into the square under guard, the striped cotton cloth laid out for inspection by buyers who will ship it onward to the African coast within the week. A particular pattern of narrow indigo stripes commands the highest prices, you learn, prized by certain coastal kingdoms as currency in its own right, worth as much in a trade negotiation as the silver coin most merchants in this square actually deal in. You watch the women who weave it stand silently to one side while their work is haggled over, their hands, when you look closely, marked with the same kind of small, permanent calluses you have begun to notice on your own from years of gripping a quill. 2 different trades leaving 2 different but equally lasting marks on 2 very different kinds of labor. You have heard it said in the low voices people use for things they do not say directly, that his grandfather arrived on this island nearly a century ago among those who fled the forced conversions and persecutions back in Portugal and Spain, and that families like his, scattered across these islands and along this coast, built much of the trading network that still moves goods and money through this harbor today. Senor Vaz never speaks of any of this himself, and you have learned not to ask, because some histories on this island are carried quietly, present and visible, but rarely discussed directly in open daylight. Salt comes through this harbor too, scraped by hand from the flats on the islands of Mayo and Boa Vista, and horses bred on the dry hills of Santiago itself, animals raised here specifically to be shipped back across to the African coast and sold for use in wars and ceremonies you will never see. You record all of it, eventually, in one ledger or another, until the categories blur together in your mind at the end of a long week. Salt, cloth, horses, people, each one a column of numbers with a price beside it. One evening, walking home later than usual after a long day of copying entries, you pass an open doorway where two merchants are arguing in low, urgent voices about news from across the sea. Something about English ships, something about a man whose name keeps getting repeated like a curse. You do not catch the full conversation, only fragments. The Spanish king, the English queen, a captain whose ships have been raiding Spanish holdings in the Caribbean for years now, and who, according to the rumor moving through the harbor taverns, might one day turn his attention toward weaker targets along the Atlantic crossing routes. You think little of it at the time. Rumors of distant wars move through this town the way weather moves through it. Present, occasionally alarming, but ultimately something that happens elsewhere, to other people, in other harbors. Mestre Vicente, when you mention it to him the next morning, only shrugs and tells you that men have been afraid of pirates on this coast since before either of you were born, and that fear, in his experience, accomplishes far less than careful bookkeeping ever has. Your mother waits up for you most nights, even now that you are a grown man with a trade, sitting near the single lamp in the front room with mending in her lap that she rarely seems to actually work on. She asks you, most evenings, whether you ate enough that day, and you tell her yes even on the days when you did not, because you have learned that the truth would only worry her, and worry is a luxury neither of you can afford to spend much time on. Your house sits 2 streets back from the harbor, close enough that you can hear the bells from the lookout post even with the shutters closed. A modest stone building your father built with his own hands in the years after he first arrived from the Algarve, back when this town still felt to him like a place where a poor man with skill in his hands might actually rise. He never did rise, not really, not in any way that mattered to the men who governed this island, and you have come to understand, in the 2 years since his death, that this was never a question of his skill or his effort. It was simply the shape of the world he had stepped into. A man born in Portugal itself, with a royal appointment in his pocket, can arrive on this island with nothing and still outrank a Branco da Terra family that has lived here for 2 generations, because rank in this colony is not built from labor or knowledge of the land. It is built from proximity to the crown, and proximity to the crown is not something your family has ever possessed, no matter how many ledgers your father or you have filled with careful, faithful numbers. You feel this most sharply on feast days, when the governor and his officials process through the square in their fine coats toward the cathedral, while you and your mother stand among the other Brancos da Terra families, close enough to see the embroidery on their sleeves, but never close enough to be greeted by name. You have learned not to mind this, mostly. Mostly is not the same as entirely. Your closest friend from childhood, A young man named Duarte, whose family runs a small workshop mending ship rigging near the harbor, often walks with you on the rare Sunday afternoons when neither of you has work, and the two of you talk sometimes about the futures you imagine for yourselves, futures that almost always involve leaving this island for somewhere larger, Lisbon perhaps, or even further, though neither of you has ever had the money or the connections to actually attempt such a journey. Duarte teases you sometimes about your ink-stained fingers, calling you the king's counter behind your back in a tone that is half affectionate and half something closer to pity, because everyone on this island understands, without needing it explained, exactly what kind of counting you do for a living. You do not tell him much about the wharf itself, about the categories you call out, about the sounds people make when they are separated from each other under the rules of a manifest. There are some things you are learning that do not survive being spoken aloud to someone who has not seen them. The Free Pardo families of the town occupy a strange position that you have only recently begun to fully understand, neither fully accepted by the peninsular officials nor grouped together with the enslaved, holding small trades and occasionally small parcels of land, their status shifting depending on who is speaking and what that person stands to gain by the conversation. A woman named Senhora Filipa, free-born, of mixed Portuguese and West African descent, runs a small shop near the market selling cloth and thread, and you have known her your entire life, since she once nursed you through a fever as a small child alongside your own mother, the two women having been close neighbors for decades despite the different worlds they technically belong to. You stop by her shop sometimes after work, not to buy anything, only to sit for a few minutes in the cool shade of her doorway and let the day's tension drain slightly from your shoulders before walking the rest of the way home. She never asks you directly about the wharf, but she watches you carefully on the days you visit after a ship has come in, and once, only once, she reached across the counter and held your wrist for a moment, the ink-stained one, without saying anything at all. You think about that small, silent gesture more often than you expect to. The rains have been thin this year, thinner than the year before, and the older farmers up in the hills above the valley speak of it in the same worried tones your father once used when a harvest failed, because this island has never had much soil to spare, and a poor rainy season here does not mean inconvenience the way it might somewhere greener. It means hunger, spread unevenly across a population that is already stretched thin between subsistence farming, fishing, and whatever wages the harbor trade provides. You hear, secondhand, that the price of grain brought in from outside the island has begun to climb, and you notice it yourself when your mother mentions, almost in passing, that she has had to stretch the household stores further than she would like this month. None of this touches the harbor trade directly, not yet. The ships carrying captives and cloth and salt continue arriving on their own schedule regardless of what the hills above the valley are doing. But you begin to sense, even this early, a kind of strain running underneath the surface of the town, a tightness in the way people speak to each other in the market, a shortness that was not there a year ago. You find yourself, in these early months, settling into the strange rhythm of the work, not because the difficulty fades, but because the body and the mind both find ways to carry weight that at first seemed impossible to lift at all. You take a quiet pride, despite everything, in the cleanliness of your columns, the legibility of your hand, the speed with which you can now total a long page of figures without losing your place. Mestre Vicente begins trusting you with small tasks beyond simple transcription, sending you to cross-check a captain's manifest against the actual count taken at the wharf. A job that matters because captains have been known on occasion to claim deaths during the crossing that never actually happened. Deaths that would otherwise reduce the number of people owed in tax to the crown. You catch your first discrepancy in your third month, a manifest claiming 3 deaths at sea where your own count at the wharf recorded none missing. And when you bring this quietly to Mestre Vicente's attention, he studies the 2 pages for a long moment before folding them both away into his satchel without comment. He tells you later that day, in a voice pitched low enough that no one else in the customs house can hear it, that some discrepancies are worth reporting and some are worth forgetting, and that learning to tell the difference is the real skill of this job, far more than penmanship or arithmetic. You do not ask him what determines which is which. Some part of you already suspects you do not want to know. You begin to notice, once you start looking, that the customs house itself runs on more than the rules written in the Crown's own statutes. A certain captain's manifest is always approved without much scrutiny. A certain merchant's cargo always seems to arrive with a count slightly lower than what you yourself observed on the wharf. A discrepancy that somehow never makes its way into the final ledger sent to Lisbon. You begin to understand, slowly and uncomfortably, that the ink in your hand is not simply recording a truth that exists independently of you. The ink in certain hands can also bend that truth, just slightly, just enough, in exchange for favors that never appear in writing anywhere. You ask Mestre Vicente once, carefully, choosing your words the way you might choose footing on wet stone, whether the Crown ever sends anyone to check the ledgers against what actually happens on the wharf. He tells you that an inspector comes from Lisbon every few years, though rarely on any schedule anyone can predict, and that when one does arrive, the customs house finds itself, in the weeks before his ship is sighted, remarkably thorough and remarkably honest, as though honesty were a coat kept folded in a chest and taken out only for special occasions. You think about your father in moments like this, about the trunk of tools he carried from the Algarve and the modest, careful life he built with them. And you wonder whether he ever stood exactly where you are standing now, weighing the same quiet arithmetic between what is right and what is simply the way things are done. You are 19, soon to be 20, and you are beginning to learn that the world you have inherited runs on 2 sets of books, the one everyone is permitted to see, and the one that exists only in the understanding between men who have learned to read each other's silences. Autumn arrives on the island the way it always does, with little real change in temperature but a noticeable shift in the wind, and the harbor grows busier rather than quieter, more ships arriving from the African coast as traders rush to move their cargo before the worst of the winter crossing season makes the Atlantic passage harder. You find yourself standing on the wharf more often now, sometimes twice in a single week, your satchel worn soft at the corners from constant handling, your hand steady enough that Mestre Vicente has begun letting you call categories yourself while he checks your work rather than performing it himself. There is a different weight to being the one who calls the categories rather than the one who only writes them down. A weight you did not fully understand until the first morning Mestre Vicente stepped back and told you, simply, that it was your turn. Your voice the first time comes out steadier than you expect. Sound, child under 10, elderly, marked separately, the words falling into the same rhythm you have heard him use dozens of times now, and you feel something settle into place inside you that you are not entirely proud of, a kind of fluency that only comes from repetition, the same fluency a butcher develops or a gravedigger. You tell yourself, on the walk home that evening, that fluency is not the same thing as approval, that a steady voice calling out categories does not mean your conscience has gone quiet, only that your conscience has learned, out of necessity, to do its work in silence rather than in your hands or your voice. You are not sure, lying awake that night, whether you believe yourself. It is on one of these autumn mornings, with the sun still low over the water and the air still cool enough to be almost pleasant, that a ship arrives carrying a cargo unlike any you have counted before, and among the men, women, and children brought up from its hold, one face will lodge itself in your memory in a way that none of the others so far ever quite have. You do not know it yet, standing there with your quill ready and your ledger open on your arm, the categories already half formed on your tongue. But this particular morning is the one your mind will return to again and again for the rest of your life. The ship that morning carries 43 people up from its hold, and you call out categories for 42 of them without much difficulty. Your voice steady, your hand sure, the rhythm of the work carrying you the way it has carried you through dozens of mornings before this one. The 43rd is a young woman, close to your own age, and what catches your attention first is not her face but her hands, calloused in a particular pattern across the palm and fingers that you recognize because you have seen the same marks on the hands of smiths and metal workers along the harbor your entire life. She does not look at the ground the way most people do in this line, exhausted past the point of caring where their eyes fall. She looks at everything, the stone buildings along the quay, the angle of the harbor wall, the position of the sun, her gaze moving with a deliberate, careful attention that you recognize because it is the same attention you bring to a column of figures that needs to be checked twice. You have learned over your years at the customs house the rough shape of where cargoes like this one originate. Captives marched for days or weeks from inland villages and kingdoms toward the rivers the Portuguese call the Rios de Escravos, the slave rivers where coastal middlemen and Portuguese agents purchase them from inland traders before loading them onto smaller vessels for the short crossing to this island. A person standing on this wharf today may have walked further in the past month than you have walked in your entire life, through terrain and heat that you have never had to survive, arriving here already carrying a kind of endurance you cannot fully imagine, only observe from the safe distance of your ledger and your quill. She is not lost in grief the way the others appear to be, you notice. She is mapping something. She is trying to learn this place the way you once had to learn the categories in Mestre Vicente's ledgers, by careful, repeated observation. Mestre Vicente calls out her category before you can stop him. Adult female, sound. You write it down, your pen moving without your full permission, the ink already drying before you have decided what, if anything, you are going to do about what you noticed in her hands and her eyes. You learn her name 3 days later, almost by accident, standing near the seasoning compound on an errand for Mestre Vicente, when you overhear one of the guards use it while calling her to the gate. Aisatu. The guard mispronounces it, flattening the sound the way Portuguese tongues tend to flatten names that were never built for this language, but you catch enough of it to remember. You find yourself returning to the compound twice more that week, on errands that did not strictly require your presence, telling yourself each time that you are simply checking a detail in the records, though some part of you understands, even as you walk, that this is not entirely true. You do not speak to her. There is no opportunity to, and even if there were, you are not certain what you would say, or what language the two of you might share enough of to be understood. What you do instead on the morning her group is finally brought to the wharf for final sale is something smaller, something that costs you almost nothing in the moment and yet sits in your chest for years afterward. The buyer inspecting her, a merchant's agent acting on behalf of a sugar plantation owner whose name you have heard before in less than admiring tones, asks Mestre Vicente whether the woman shows any signs of a particular skill that might raise her price for resale rather than field labor. Mestre Vicente glances at you, since you were the one who recorded the original entry, and asks whether you noted anything of the kind in your observations from the wharf. You answer that you noted nothing beyond the standard category, sound, adult female, no visible trade marked in the record. This is technically true since you never actually wrote down what you noticed about her hands. It is also, in every way that matters, a lie, an omission built carefully enough to look like simple thoroughness rather than what it actually is. You tell yourself this small omission might keep her out of a smith's forge somewhere and away from the particular plantation owner's reputation for working skilled captives harder than unskilled ones, on the logic that skill can be replaced more easily than unskilled muscle. You do not know whether this reasoning is true. You do not know whether it changes anything at all about what happens to her next. You only know that it is the one choice available to you that morning, and you made it, and the ledger now carries a small untruth that no one besides you will ever notice. She is sold that same afternoon, her name converted into a sum of money in a transaction you record in a different column entirely, and by evening she is gone from the seasoning compound, bound for a ship that will carry her across an ocean you will never cross yourself. You do not see her again. You think about her, on and off, for years afterward, the way a person thinks about a door they noticed, but never had the courage to open further than a crack. That evening you walk to Senora Filipa's shop instead of going straight home, and you sit in the cool shade of her doorway longer than usual, saying nothing, until she finally sets down the cloth she has been folding and asks you, gently, what is sitting on you so heavily? You tell her only a little, not the details, only that you made a small choice that day that you cannot decide was right or wrong, and she listens without judgment, the way she has listened to half the town's quiet troubles over the years from behind that same counter. She tells you that on this island, a person rarely gets to choose between right and wrong in any clean sense, only between worse and slightly less worse, and that learning to live inside that narrow space without losing yourself entirely is, in her experience, the closest thing to wisdom this place has to offer. She has lived long enough on this island, you remember, watching her hands smooth the folded cloth in front of her, to have made her own share of narrow choices, a free woman of mixed blood running a shop in a town where her own standing could shift depending on the mood of whichever official happened to be passing through that week. You carry her words home with you that night, turning them over the way you might turn over a coin to check both faces. The months that follow blur together in a way the earlier ones did not. The wharf, the ledgers, the categories, all of it continuing with the same grim regularity, while underneath the surface of the town, the strain you first noticed in the market begins to deepen into something harder to ignore. The rains fail again the following year, worse than the year before, and this time the hardship reaches further than grain prices in the market. Farmers from the hills above the valley begin appearing in town more frequently, thinner than you remember them, some offering what little they have left to trade for food rather than coin, and you notice, walking to work some mornings, faces along the road that you do not recognize, families who have walked down from drier parts of the island in search of anything at all. You see a man one morning, sitting against the cathedral wall with two small children pressed close beside him, and you recognize, with a discomfort that catches in your throat, that the bones of his face have begun to show through his skin in a way they would not if he had eaten properly in recent weeks. You give him the bread you were carrying for your own midday meal, not because it solves anything, you understand even as you hand it over that it solves almost nothing, but because the alternative, walking past him with a full satchel and an empty conscience, feels suddenly unbearable after the choice you made on the wharf weeks earlier. You wonder whether small kindnesses like this one are meant to balance something larger inside you, or whether they are simply what is left over once the larger thing has already been decided. You have heard the older men in the market speak of this pattern before, the way a poor rainy season returns to these islands again and again, roughly once every 5 years by their own rough counting, never quite often enough for anyone to plan around it properly, never quite rare enough for anyone to forget what hunger feels like in the years between. The soil here was thin even before the first ships arrived a century and more ago. The older farmers tell you, volcanic rock barely softened into earth, and 100 years of grazing and clearing for crops has stripped away what little held the moisture in the ground, so that even a modest dry season now arrives harder than it once did, the land itself having grown thinner alongside the people trying to survive on it. You think about this connection sometimes while standing on the wharf, watching ships arrive heavy with one kind of cargo and depart heavy with another, cloth and salt and horses moving outward while the island itself seems to grow steadily less able to feed the people left behind to manage all of it. The island's economy, you are coming to understand more clearly with each passing season, was never built to feed itself. It was built to move other things, people, cloth, salt, horses, through this harbor and onward to wherever the Crown's interests required them to go. And in a poor rainy year, that arrangement leaves very little cushion for the people who actually live here. The Panos cloth trade slows slightly that year, since the enslaved women who weave it on plantations across the island are themselves weaker from the same hunger touching everyone else, and a slower cloth trade means fewer captives can be purchased on the African coast in exchange for it. A chain of cause and effect that you trace through the ledgers with a kind of horrified fascination, watching how directly one failure connects to the next. Horses bred on the dry hills fare somewhat better since they require less from the land than crops do, and the trade in them across to the African coast continues largely unaffected, one of the few columns in your ledgers that holds steady while others around it shrink. You hear, around this time, that a royal inspector is expected to arrive from Lisbon sometime in the coming months, the first such visit in nearly 4 years, according to Mestre Vicente, and the customs house spends an unusually careful few weeks ensuring that every ledger is copied cleanly, every discrepancy quietly resolved before any outside eyes might fall upon it. The inspector, when he finally arrives, is a thin, precise man named Dom Rodrigo, dressed in clothes far finer than anything you own, who addresses Mestre Vicente with a polite but unmistakable condescension, the tone a man uses when speaking to someone he considers competent but fundamentally beneath him. He barely glances at you at all during his week on the island, his eyes passing over you the way they might pass over a stool or a writing desk, a useful piece of furniture rather than a person worth acknowledging. And you feel, watching him move through the customs house, as though he owns every stone of it, the full weight of what your mother once told you plainly when you were a boy. A Branco de Terra can serve the crown faithfully for 100 years, she said, and the crown will still send a stranger from Lisbon to check his work. Mestre Vicente pulls you aside one afternoon during that same week, his voice lower and more serious than you have heard it before, and tells you plainly that whatever you may have noticed over the past 2 years about certain manifests, certain counts that did not quite match what happened on the wharf, none of it is to be mentioned to Dom Rodrigo under any circumstances. Dom Rodrigo spends 2 further days reviewing nothing more than the customs house's outward-facing ledgers, the ones Mestre Vicente has spent weeks preparing for exactly this purpose, and asks you directly, on the second of those days, whether you find the work of this office honest. You answer that you do your best to record what you see accurately, a sentence that is, you realize even as you say it, carefully built to be true without quite answering the question he actually asked. He studies you for a long moment, the kind of look a man gives a column of figures he suspects but cannot prove has been altered, before finally nodding and moving on to his next question. Hearing this exchange replay in your mind that evening, you recognize with a small cold drop in your stomach that you have already become part of the second set of books you first noticed in your earlier months here, not through any single dramatic choice, but through a slow accumulation of small silences, the same kind of silence that let you omit a detail about a young woman's hands. You wonder, walking home that evening, how many more silences a person can carry before the weight of them changes who he actually is. The inspector examines what he is shown, asks a handful of questions that Mestre Vicente answers smoothly, and departs again within a week, satisfied enough, apparently, to report back to Lisbon that the customs house of Ribeira Grande continues to serve the crown's interests faithfully. Life on the wharf resumes its familiar rhythm once he is gone. Ships arriving, cargoes counted, categories called out in your own steady voice more often than not now. The work settling back into its grim, ordinary shape, the way water settles back into a disturbed pool once the stone that struck it has sunk and stilled. You are 23 years old by the time the drought finally breaks and the rains return to the hills, and you find yourself, in the relief that follows the first real harvest in 2 years, almost able to forget the weight you have been carrying since the morning. A young woman with a smith's calloused hands looked at this town as though she were memorizing it for a purpose you will never fully understand. Almost able to forget, not entirely. That same season, you sit with Duarte one evening in a small harbor tavern, the two of you sharing a single cup of wine between work shifts, when a group of sailors at the next table begin talking in low, urgent tones about news carried in from a ship just arrived from the Spanish coast. You catch fragments at first, the same way you caught fragments of a similar conversation years earlier. Something about an English fleet gathering in a port called Plymouth. Something about a captain the Spanish call El Draque, the dragon, a name spoken with the particular mixture of fear and grudging respect that men reserve for an enemy who has beaten them before. Duarte leans closer to you, lowering his own voice, and tells you he has heard this captain has spent years harassing Spanish ships and ports across the Caribbean, and that with Portugal now bound to the Spanish crown under the same king, there is no reason left for such a man to spare a Portuguese harbor any more than a Spanish one. You did not pay close attention 5 years earlier, when word first reached this island that the old Portuguese royal line had died out, and that Philip, King of Spain, had pressed his own claim to the Portuguese throne by force, marching an army into Lisbon while the country's nobles argued over a dozen weaker claimants. You were 18 then, a year out from your first morning at the customs house, with far more attention to spare for your letters and your mother's grief over your father's recent death than for which crown sat over which palace. It makes more sense to you now, sitting in this tavern with a cup of wine going warm in your hand. Every clerk in this customs house has learned the same lesson, that paperwork follows power, and the moment Portugal became Spain's possession in all but name, every Portuguese harbor, every Portuguese ship, every Portuguese colony scattered across 2 oceans became, in the eyes of Spain's enemies, a Spanish target as well. England's Queen has never declared open war on Spain in any formal sense that reaches this island's understanding, but her ships have been raiding Spanish treasure routes and Spanish ports for years now, and the sailors at the next table speak of this captain's reputation the way men speak of weather they have seen coming for a long time and hoped, against reason, might somehow pass them by. You think for the first time about the low stone walls around this town, about the handful of cannons mounted near the harbor mouth, about the militia of local farmers and tradesmen who turn out for drills a few times a year and call themselves a defense, and you feel something cold settle in your stomach that has nothing to do with the wine. There is no real fortress here, you realize, turning the thought over carefully. Only a scattering of old gun positions built decades ago against smaller threats. Nothing close to what a town holding the wealth this one holds might actually need against a fleet of any real size. You tell yourself, walking home later that night past the dark, empty pillar in the square, that rumors of distant captains have moved through this harbor before and come to nothing. That fear, as Mestre Vicente once told you, accomplishes far less than careful bookkeeping ever has. You repeat this to yourself a second time, more quietly, the way a person repeats a prayer they are no longer certain they believe, and you notice that the repetition does not steady you the way Mestre Vicente's original words once did. Your mother is asleep by the time you reach home. The lamp burned low beside her mending, and you sit for a long moment in the dark front room before climbing the narrow stairs to your own bed, your mind moving back and forth between the dragon captain's name and the calloused hands of a woman you will never see again. 2 fears that have nothing to do with each other, and yet somehow, in the quiet of that house, feel like they belong to the same widening crack in the floor of the world you thought you understood. That comfort will not last, not nearly as long as you want it to. The months after that night in the tavern move differently than the months before it. The way a room feels different once you have learned there is a crack in its foundation, even if the crack itself has not grown any wider yet. You find yourself listening more carefully now to every conversation that drifts through the customs house, every fragment of news a captain or a sailor brings in alongside his cargo manifest, gathering pieces of a larger picture the way you once gathered pieces of the categories Mestre Vicente taught you in your first weeks here. The picture, once you assemble enough of it, is not a comfortable one. The Iberian Union that put a Spanish king over the Portuguese crown is no longer distant news to you now, the way it once was when you first heard of it as a boy of 18. It has become the lens through which every rumor reaching this harbor now has to be read. Portugal did not vanish as a kingdom in name, but in every practical sense that matters to a small colony on the far edge of the Atlantic. It became an extension of Spain's much larger empire, its governors answering in the end to the same crown that rules Madrid, its ships and ports now standing wherever Spain's enemies choose to strike. Turning this over in the quiet hours at your desk, you see it clearly now. Ribeira Grande was never an important target in its own right before this union of crowns. It was a Portuguese harbor, modest by the standards of the wider Atlantic world, valuable mainly to the men who profited from what passed through it. Now it is something else as well. It is a piece of Spain's empire, however small, however far from Madrid, and the English captain whose name has been spreading through every harbor tavern on this coast has spent the better part of a decade proving that no piece of that empire, however small or far away, is truly safe from him. You learn, piecing together fragments from sailors who have crossed paths with this captain's reputation in other ports, that he first made his name more than a decade ago raiding Spanish settlements and treasure routes along the coast the Spanish call the Main, striking towns and capturing ships with a boldness that earned him both a fortune and a personal grudge from the Spanish crown itself. He vanished from those waters for a time, the sailors tell you, sailing around the entire world in a single voyage that took him years and made him famous even among men who had never set foot near the sea, before returning to England with holds full of captured Spanish silver and a reputation that has only grown sharper with each passing year since. You ask Mestre Vicente directly, one quiet afternoon when the customs house stands empty of other business, whether the Crown has sent any word about strengthening the town's defenses against a threat of this kind. He tells you, with the particular flatness he reserves for unwelcome truths, that Lisbon's attention has been fixed for years now on wars and rivalries closer to home, and that a small colony of slave traders and salt scrapers in the middle of the Atlantic sits very low on any list of priorities a busy crown might keep. The town's defenses, as far as either of you can determine, amount to a scattering of old cannon positions along the harbor wall, manned by a militia of farmers, fishermen, and tradesmen who drill a handful of times each year and otherwise spend their days at the ordinary business of staying alive on a dry island. You have stood among that militia yourself on drill days, a borrowed pike, heavy and unfamiliar against the calluses a quill has worn into your palm, watching men who spend their week mending nets or tending goats attempt to form the kind of disciplined line a sergeant from Lisbon once showed them years ago and never returned to correct. There is no real fortress here. Nothing close to the kind of stone walls and bastions you have heard described in stories of larger Spanish and Portuguese ports across the ocean. There is only a town built around its wealth rather than its safety, because for over a century, wealth was the only thing this harbor ever truly needed to protect. You begin sleeping less well after that conversation, though you tell no one, not even your mother, exactly why. Duarte, when you finally tell him what Mestre Vicente said about the trade winds and the single practical route across the ocean, goes quiet for a long moment before asking you, half joking and half not, whether the two of you ought to start thinking about which direction inland a man might run if the worst ever actually arrived. You laugh at the question, the way you have laughed at most things this past year, a thin sound that does not quite reach the place inside you where the real fear lives. And you tell him that running inland would do little good on an island this small and this dry, where there is nowhere far enough from the coast to truly disappear. Duarte's own family has begun stockpiling what extra rope and canvas they can manage in their workshop, not for any official defense purpose, but simply because a man who works with his hands tends to trust his hands more than he trusts a governor's promises, and you find yourself, in the weeks that follow, doing something similar in your own quiet way, setting aside a few coins here and there in a place your mother does not know about, just in case the ordinary rhythm of this town's life is ever interrupted in a way neither of you can yet imagine. You ask Duarte, one evening, whether his father has considered simply leaving the island altogether, taking the family's savings to Lisbon, or further still, somewhere a fleet of English ships would have no particular reason to find. Duarte laughs at this, not unkindly, and reminds you that his family has buried 3 generations in the cemetery above the cathedral, and that a man does not abandon ground his grandfather cleared with his own hands over the rumor of a ship that may never actually arrive. You think of your own father's grave in that same cemetery, and you understand, without needing Duarte to say anything further, exactly what he means. Your mother's own health, meanwhile, has begun to trouble you in ways that have nothing to do with sails on the horizon. She has always been a thin woman, but over the past year you have noticed her thinning further, her hands shaking slightly when she lifts a pot from the fire, her breath catching on the stairs in a way it never used to. You remember watching her one evening from the kitchen doorway, how she used to carry 2 full buckets of water up from the well without pausing, back when you were still a boy, and how now she sets down even a single half-filled cup to rest her arm before lifting it again. A physician in town, one of the few on the island with any real training, examines her one afternoon while you wait outside the door of your own house like a stranger, and tells you afterward, in the careful, measured voice physicians use when they do not wish to frighten a family more than necessary, that her heart has simply grown tired, and that rest, good food, and as little strain as possible are the only remedies he can offer. Good food on this island in these years is not a small thing to provide. The price of grain and meat has climbed steadily since the worst of the drought, and your clerk's wage, steady as it is, was never meant to stretch much beyond the simple needs of 2 people living carefully. You begin taking on small additional tasks beyond your regular duties, copying private correspondence for merchants in the evenings, helping tally accounts for traders who pay a little something extra for a clerk they trust to keep his mouth shut about what he sees in their books. One of these merchants is Henrique Vaz, the quiet trader whose family has lived on this island for 3 generations, and the work he offers you, at first, seems harmless enough, simple transcription of shipping records for his own private use. It is several months into this arrangement before you understand what you have actually agreed to. Senor Vaz asks you one evening, his voice as calm and unhurried as ever. Whether you might adjust a particular cargo count from a recent ship, lowering the recorded number by a small margin before it reaches the official ledger, in exchange for a sum of money that would cover your mother's physician for the better part of a year. You sit with the request for a long moment, the lamp between you throwing soft light across his careful, patient face, and it becomes clear that he has chosen this moment to ask precisely because he knows, as everyone in this small town eventually comes to know everyone else's troubles, exactly how much your mother's illness weighs on you. You think of Mestre Vicente's words from years earlier about discrepancies worth reporting and discrepancies worth forgetting, and you understand, finally, fully, what kind of clerk you have become without ever quite deciding to become him. You agree. You tell yourself it is a small adjustment, a handful of names shifted from one column to another, no different in scale from the omission you once made for a young woman with calloused hands, except that this time the silence buys your mother another year of decent food and proper care, rather than buying anyone else's safety. The money arrives quietly, the way such money always does on this island, and your mother's meals improve, and the physician continues his visits, and you tell yourself, lying awake at night, that you have simply learned to survive the way every other clerk in this customs house has learned to survive. You are no longer entirely certain, on the nights when sleep refuses to come, whether the man who first stood nervously on the wharf 5 years ago, quill trembling in his hand, still exists inside you in any recognizable form. The talk of the English captain does not fade as the months pass. If anything, it grows louder, sharper, carried in by every ship that puts in from the Spanish coast or the Canary Islands. You hear that autumn that the captain has assembled a fleet larger than any single raiding voyage anyone in this harbor can remember. Dozens of ships by some accounts, soldiers numbering well into the thousands, and that the fleet has already sailed from an English port, with its destination unknown to anyone but the captain himself and whoever holds his confidence. Some of the older sailors in the tavern argue that a fleet of that size must be bound for somewhere larger and richer than this small island. A Spanish port in the Caribbean, perhaps, or along the coast of the mainland itself, and that Ribeira Grande, modest as it is, has little to fear from a force gathered for grander purposes. Others disagree, pointing out that a fleet crossing the Atlantic needs fresh water, food, and a place to rest its crews before the longer ocean passage, exactly the kind of provisions this harbor has supplied to passing ships of every flag for over a century, English vessels among them in years when no war stood between the two crowns at all. Mestre Vicente, when you press him for his own opinion one evening, only shakes his head slowly and tells you that a fleet sailing south from England in this season, with the trade winds running the way they do, has only one practical route across the Atlantic, and that route passes directly within sight of these islands, whether the captain intends to stop here or not. You find yourself, after that conversation, looking out at the horizon more often than you used to, on your walk to and from the customs house each day, though you could not say exactly what you expect to see there. The governor, a man named Gaspar de Andrade, orders a modest strengthening of the harbor's defenses that autumn additional powder stored. The militia called for an extra round of drills, lookouts posted along the headlands east and west of the town with instructions to watch for unfamiliar sails. You attend one of these extra drills yourself, standing in a loose line beside Duarte and a dozen other men from the harbor district. A sergeant who once served briefly with the regular Portuguese army, shouting commands that half the men around you struggle to follow with any real precision. The old bronze cannons mounted along the harbor wall, you learn that same afternoon from one of the gunners assigned to maintain them, have not been fired in earnest in living memory, used mainly for ceremonial salutes on feast days rather than any actual engagement. And you wonder, watching the gunner check the touch holes with visible uncertainty, how many of those guns would even function correctly if the moment ever came to use them as intended. It is not much. Everyone in the customs house understands, without saying it aloud, that it is not nearly enough, that a militia of farmers and a handful of old cannons stand little real chance against a force of the size the sailors describe in the tavern. You continue your work through these weeks because there is nothing else to do. Ships still arriving from the African coast on their own indifferent schedule, cargoes still counted, categories still called out in your steady, practiced voice, the machinery of the trade continuing to turn even as the men operating it glance, more and more often, toward the empty horizon to the north. Mestre Vicente begins, without ever quite saying so directly, making certain the most important ledgers, the records of duties owed and cargoes counted over the past several years, are kept closer at hand than usual, gathered into a single locked chest near his own desk, rather than spread across the open shelves where they normally sit. You ask him once, carefully, what the point of safeguarding paper might be if the worst truly comes, and he tells you that paper is the only proof this customs house has of its own faithful service to the crown, and that a man's work, in the end, is sometimes the only thing left standing after everything else is burned. You do not yet understand how literally those words will prove true. You walk past the harbor warehouses often enough in these uneasy weeks to understand exactly how much sits stored inside them. Casks of wine and olive oil brought from Madeira and the Azores, barrels of vinegar, sacks of wheat awaiting shipment onward to the Spanish colonies across the oceans, bolts of silk and fine cloth that merchants like Señor Vaz have spent years accumulating against future sale. It occurs to you, walking past those warehouse doors one afternoon, that this town has spent over a century gathering exactly the kind of wealth that might tempt a captain like the one the sailors keep describing, and that the very prosperity built on the trade you have spent 5 years recording is now the same prosperity that makes this harbor worth attacking at all. You stop at Signora Filipa's shop one evening that same week, and she asks you, more directly than usual, whether you believe the rumors moving through the harbor taverns are anything more than rumors this time. You tell her honestly that you do not know, and she nods slowly, setting down the bolt of cloth she had been measuring, and tells you that she has lived through smaller scares before. A French ship sighted once years ago that never came any closer than the horizon, and that perhaps this will pass the same way. Neither of you quite believes it, even as the words leave her mouth. Your mother grows stronger through that autumn, the good food and rest finally showing some effect, color returning to her face in a way that brings you a relief sharp enough to almost outweigh the guilt still sitting beneath it. You tell yourself that whatever else you have become, at least this much was worth it. The morning of the 17th begins, in every visible way, exactly like any other morning in this town's long, ordinary history. You wake before the cathedral bell, as you have for years now, and you eat a simple breakfast across the table from your mother, who looks better that morning than she has in months, her color good, her hands steady around her own cup, and you allow yourself walking out the door toward the customs house, a small private satisfaction at how far she has come since the worst of her illness. The harbor, when you reach it, looks exactly as it always does at that hour. Fishermen already out past the breakwater, a single trading ship riding at anchor near the quay, gulls circling low over scraps left from the previous day's catch, the whole town settling into the same unremarkable rhythm it has followed for over a century. Mestre Vicente greets you at the customs house door with his usual brief nod, already at work on a stack of correspondence that arrived the previous evening, and the two of you spend the early part of the morning exactly as you have spent hundreds of mornings before this one, comparing figures, correcting small errors, discussing in low voices which merchants manifest might require a closer look before the week is out. It is the 17th day of November, by the reckoning later written into the ledgers that survive what comes next, when the lookout posted on the eastern headland sends his signal down to the town in a hurried, broken rhythm that every soul in Ribeira Grande has learned, by now, to dread. Sails. More sails than anyone watching that morning can immediately count, spread wide across the horizon where the sea meets the pale early sky, moving steadily, unmistakably, toward this harbor that has never, in over a century of standing here, faced anything close to what is now bearing down upon it. You are standing near the customs house door when the bell begins to ring, not the familiar 3 strikes that announce a single trading ship, but a different rhythm entirely, fast and continuous, a sound this town has never had real cause to use before, and you understand, even before anyone says the words aloud, exactly what it means. The alarm bell does not stop ringing for nearly a quarter of an hour, and in that time the harbor you have known your entire life transforms into something you no longer recognize. Men abandon half-loaded carts in the street. A woman runs past you clutching a single iron pot to her chest, leaving everything else behind. Somewhere near the market square, a child is crying, separated for a moment from whoever was holding his hand, and the sound cuts through the general noise in a way that makes your stomach turn over. Mestre Vicente grips your arm before you can move toward the door, his face paler than you have ever seen it, and tells you, in a voice stripped of all its usual flatness, that the two of you need to move the locked chest of ledgers out of the customs house immediately, before anyone thinks to use this building for anything but record-keeping. You help him carry the chest between you, heavier than you expected, your hands slipping with sweat against the iron handles. Out the back door of the customs house and up a narrow lane toward the hills that rise behind the town, where a handful of other men are already half carrying, half dragging whatever valuables they could not bear to leave behind. The streets you pass through on the way feel unrecognizable already, doors hanging open, a stall in the market abandoned mid-sale, fruit scattered across the cobblestones where someone dropped their basket and did not stop to gather it back up. You catch sight, through one open doorway, of an old woman too frail to move quickly, being half carried by 2 younger relatives, her bare feet dragging against the stone. Not everyone in this town has the strength or the family to manage what you and Mestre Vicente are managing right now. You think, absurdly, in the middle of all this chaos, that you are running uphill with 5 years of your own handwriting locked inside a wooden box, as though ink could somehow outweigh everything else this town is about to lose. Mestre Vicenta tells you, once the chest is wedged into a hollow beneath an overhanging rock a fair distance up the slope, that you need to go find your mother now, that the ledgers will keep but a person will not, and something in the way he says it, urgent and almost gentle at once, breaks through the strange numbness that has carried you this far. You run back down into the lower streets against the current of people fleeing upward, your lungs burning, your mind fixed on nothing but the shape of your own front door, and you find your mother already outside it, a small bundle of clothes and food clutched against her chest, her face white with fear, but her hands, you notice even in that moment, surprisingly steady. She does not ask you where you have been. She simply takes your arm, and the two of you join the river of people moving up out of the valley toward the higher ground inland, where the dry hills offer no real shelter but at least put distance between flesh and whatever is coming. You learn, in fragments shouted between neighbors as you climb, what the lookouts on the headland actually saw. Not one or two ships, but a fleet stretching across the horizon, in numbers no one in this town has ever had to count before. More than 20 large vessels by some estimates, smaller ones scattered among them, the kind of force that makes the militia's old bronze cannons feel, suddenly, like a child's toy rather than a defense. Night falls before you, and your mother reach a position high enough to feel even slightly safe, and the two of you settle into a shallow gully alongside several other families from your street, sharing what food anyone managed to carry, listening to the darkness for any sound that might tell you what is happening below. You have never known silence to feel as loud as it does that night. The sound, when it finally comes, arrives not from the harbor itself, but from somewhere closer, a beach you cannot see from where you sit, the distant tramp of many boots moving with a discipline that no militia drill in this town has ever managed to produce, soldiers landing under cover of darkness and forming up to march on the town from a direction the lookouts were never positioned to watch closely enough. You strain to hear more, your whole body tensed against the dark, catching fragments of distant commands carried strangely on the night wind, a language that is not Portuguese and not the rough crioulo the town's own people speak among themselves, sharp and clipped in a way that makes the hair rise on the back of your neck even before you can name why. You learn only later, pieced together from survivors who saw more of that night than you did, that the English commander chose a beach roughly 4 miles east of the harbor for his landing, well away from the town's modest gun positions, and marched his men overland through the darkness in numbers close to 1,000, meeting no resistance at all along the way because there was, in truth, no one left in their path to resist them. Your mother sleeps fitfully beside you in the gully, her hand never quite letting go of your sleeve even in her sleep, and you lie awake staring up at a sky thick with more stars than you ever notice from inside the town, your mind turning over and over the same useless question, whether the chest of ledgers you and Mestre Vicente hid beneath that rock will mean anything at all by morning. Duarte finds your family sometime before dawn, having climbed a different slope with his own parents and younger sister, and the two of you sit together for a while in the dark, saying little, because there is little either of you knows yet that the other does not already suspect. His family's workshop, he tells you quietly, sat directly in the path soldiers would have taken from the harbor toward the customs house, and he has no way of knowing from up here whether the rope and canvas his father spent years accumulating still exists in any usable form. You remember the conversation you had with him weeks earlier about ground his grandfather cleared and a man not abandoning it over a rumor, and you wonder whether he is thinking of those same words now, watching the dark valley below for some sign of what has become of that ground. He does not bring it up himself, and neither do you, because some conversations only make sense once, spoken at the right moment, and repeating them again now would only sound like an accusation neither of you intends. You think of Senora Filipa's small shop near the market, the cool shade of her doorway where you once sat turning over her words about narrow choices, and you ask Duarte, almost without meaning to, whether anyone has seen her or her family climbing up with the rest of the town. He tells you he heard from someone further along the ridge that she made it out with her 2 grown sons sometime after midnight, though no one seems to know exactly where in these hills she has settled for the night, scattered as everyone has become across slopes that offer little more than thin scrub and loose stone for shelter. You find yourself praying in a quiet, unpracticed way you have not used since childhood, that the news is true. Dawn comes gray and quiet, almost ordinary, the kind of light that makes the previous night's terror feel briefly unreal, until you and several of the other men from your gully creep close enough to a ridge overlooking the valley to see what has actually happened to your town while you slept. A flag you do not recognize, red cross on white, hangs from a position near the harbor that has flown the Portuguese colors for over a century without interruption. Something has ended this morning, looking at that flag that will never quite begin again the same way. You watch from that ridge as small groups of soldiers move through the streets below, and even at this distance you can tell they are not being met with any real opposition, because there is almost no one left in those streets to oppose them, the town having emptied itself overnight the same way your own family emptied itself, fleeing upward into the dry hills rather than standing to fight a force this size. Tomas points out toward the harbor itself, where several ships ride at anchor, and tells you he counted 7 vessels there before the sun rose fully, every one of them a Portuguese slaving ship caught at anchor with nowhere to run, their crews either captured or fled into the same hills sheltering you now. You think, watching distant figures move between those ships, of every manifest you ever recorded for vessels exactly like them, ships that carried other people's freedom across an ocean now themselves seized as plunder by men who have crossed their own ocean for exactly this purpose, and the symmetry of it sits strangely in your chest, neither quite justice nor quite anything else you have a name for. Tomas tells you the English have also found the half-built caravel sitting in the small shipyard near the eastern end of the harbor, a vessel the town has been constructing slowly over the past 2 years, and that rather than simply burning it where it sits, the soldiers appear to be taking it apart piece by piece, timber and fittings alike, carrying away anything of value rather than leaving it to ash. Someone beside you on the ridge, an older fisherman named Tomas, whose family has worked this harbor for 3 generations, mutters that the only people left down there now are the ones too old or too sick to climb, and the sentence lands in your chest with a weight you were not prepared for, because you understand exactly which people he means. The seasoning compound near the edge of town holds, on any given week, a number of captives too weak from fever or injury to be moved quickly, kept under guard in a building the town has come to call, without much sentiment, the slave hospital. Standing on that ridge with your mother's hand still gripping your sleeve, you realize whoever was confined there last night had no possibility of fleeing to these hills at all. You count in your head, almost without meaning to. The way your training at the customs house has taught you to count everything, and you arrive at a rough figure close to 24 people who must still be inside those walls this morning. Too sick to walk, too weak to be worth moving even by the guards who might otherwise have herded them along with everyone else. You do not know, in that moment, whether to hope the English show them mercy or simply pass them by unnoticed, because either outcome feels like the small, bitter best this town's machinery has left for people who were never given any other kind of chance. The morning stretches into afternoon, and word begins moving up through the hills in the careful passed-along-way news travels when no one wants to be the one who carries bad tidings directly, that the English commander has set up his headquarters somewhere near the heart of the town, that his soldiers are moving methodically through the warehouses along the harbor, and that messengers have been sent out searching the hills for anyone with authority to negotiate. Mestre Vicente finds you and your mother late that afternoon, having climbed a different path up from a hiding place nearer the customs house, his clothes dusty, his face etched with an exhaustion that makes him look 10 years older than he did the previous morning. He tells you what he saw on his way up. Soldiers moving in organized lines between the warehouses near the harbor, carrying out casks of wine and vinegar, sacks of wheat, bolts of silk and fine cloth, loading it all onto carts and down to waiting boats with the same methodical efficiency you yourself once brought to counting a ship's cargo on that same wharf. He saw, too, men working at the old gun positions along the harbor wall, prying loose the bronze cannons your own militia drilled, beside only weeks earlier. The same guns the gunner once told you had not been fired in living memory, now being claimed as trophies by soldiers who clearly know their worth far better than this town's farmers and fishermen ever needed to. He tells you the chest of ledgers is still where you left it, untouched as far as he can tell, and you feel a flicker of relief at this news before immediately feeling ashamed of yourself for caring about paper while an entire town burns and starves below you. He sees the shame on your face and tells you, quietly, that caring about both things at once does not make you a smaller man. It only makes you a man trying to survive an impossible day. Your mother asks him, her voice tight with worry, whether he has any news of what the English intend to do, whether the town will be ransomed back, burned, or simply left as it stands once they have taken what they came for. Mestre Vicente shakes his head slowly and tells her the truth as plainly as he understands it himself, that the governor has already fled inland to a village called São Domingos rather than remain anywhere near the harbor, that the English commander has sent word demanding payment in exchange for sparing what remains of the town, and that no one currently knows whether anyone with the authority to pay such a ransom is even prepared to try. You spend that second night in the same shallow gully, colder this time, hungrier, your mother's small bundle of food already running thin between the families sharing it, and you watch, from your position on the hillside, a faint orange glow begin to rise from somewhere near the harbor as the night deepens, smoke catching what little moonlight there is and turning it the color of a dying ember. You do not yet know whether that glow means the whole town is burning or only a single warehouse, and the not knowing is in some ways worse than either answer would be on its own. By the third morning, hunger and exhaustion have worn most of the families in your gully down to a kind of numb endurance, conversation reduced to whispers, children too tired even to cry the way they did on the first night, and you find yourself thinking, in the strange clarity that comes with prolonged fear, about every ship you ever counted on that wharf, every person reduced to a category in your own steady hand, and wondering whether this is, in some way you cannot fully articulate, a reckoning arriving for a town that built its entire fortune on exactly this kind of fear in other people's lives. You think of the woman on your very first morning at the wharf, gripping her child's hand so hard her knuckles went pale before an officer pulled them apart anyway. You think of Aisatu's careful mapping eyes, memorizing a town she had no power to escape. You wonder whether either of them, wherever they are now, would feel anything at all to learn that the harbor which once counted them like cargo is now itself being counted, stripped, and carried away piece by men with no more regard for this town than this town ever showed for the people who passed through it. You do not share this thought with your mother. Some thoughts, you have learned, are meant to be carried alone. Mestre Vicente returns again that afternoon with fresher news, gathered from a cousin of his who slipped close enough to the town's edge to see for himself that the English have rounded up what few prisoners they managed to capture, mostly the elderly residents and the fever patients left behind in the seasoning compound, and are questioning them closely, apparently searching for the governor's exact whereabouts. You think of the patients in that compound, people you yourself may have once counted onto the wharf in some earlier year, now caught between two forces, neither of which has ever had much reason to consider their survival a priority, and the thought sits in your chest with a weight that has nothing to do with hunger or exhaustion. Word reaches the hills that evening that the governor's location has been discovered. São Domingos, the same inland village your own family has occasionally visited for market days, and that a sizable detachment of English soldiers is already moving inland to find him, a force large enough, by the descriptions reaching you, to make any thought of the village offering real resistance feel almost absurd. Tomas, who has family of his own in that direction, grows quiet when the news reaches your gully, and you understand without him needing to explain that he is doing the same arithmetic you have been doing all along, counting the distance between safety and danger, wondering whether the hills sheltering you tonight will still feel safe tomorrow if the soldiers expand their search beyond the village itself. Mestre Vicente, sitting nearby with his back against a low stone wall some shepherd built generations ago, tells you quietly that a force moving inland to chase a single fleeing governor is unlikely to waste much time scouring every hillside along the way, that their purpose is narrow and their patience by all accounts limited, since a fleet of this size cannot remain anchored off a poor island indefinitely without losing the season's advantage for whatever larger purpose brought them across the ocean in the first place. You find some thin comfort in his reasoning, though not enough to let you sleep easily. You spend that third night exactly as you spent the previous two, huddled against the dry hillside beside your mother, watching the distant glow over the harbor flicker and shift with the wind, and wondering, as sleep finally takes you near dawn, whether the town you grew up in will still exist in any recognizable form by the time you are finally able to walk back down into it. On the fourth day, word reaches your gully that the English expedition has reached São Domingos, and that the village, like the harbor town before it, was already empty by the time the soldiers arrived, its people having fled at the first sign of approaching men, just as your own town did days earlier. Mestre Vicente's cousin, who has taken to slipping closer to the action than most and bringing back what he sees, reports that the soldiers found little worth taking in São Domingos, a poor inland village with none of the harbor's accumulated wealth, and that in their frustration they set fire to what buildings stood there before turning back toward the coast. You learn 2 days later of a small skirmish on the soldiers' return march. 2 English stragglers who fell behind the main column and were caught by local militiamen still hiding in the hills, men with far more reason for fury than skill at warfare. And what happened to those 2 stragglers is described to you in terms grim enough that you do not repeat them to your mother. Fear does not only run in one direction during a raid like this one. You realize, hearing this, it runs both ways, however unevenly the rest of the outcome divides itself. The governor himself, you learn around the same time, was never actually captured, having moved further inland before the soldiers reached São Domingos, leaving the town's fate to be decided without him. On the 6th day since the alarm first rang, the smoke over the harbor thickens rather than thins, rising in columns dark enough to see clearly even from your distant hillside, and Mestre Vicente, watching it with you in grim silence, tells you he believes the English have given up on any hope of ransom and decided, instead, to take what value they can carry and destroy whatever is left behind. You watch that smoke for the better part of an entire day, unable to look away even as your eyes sting and your throat tightens with a grief you do not yet have words for, because somewhere beneath that smoke sits the cathedral you were baptized in, the customs house where you learned your trade, the white pillar in the square, the small stone house your father built with his own 2 hands. You think of him in that moment more clearly than you have in years, and you are glad, in a small, strange way, that he is not alive to watch this. By the 8th day, the smoke has thinned considerably, and scouts moving cautiously down toward the lower slopes report that the English ships have begun loading their final plunder, preparing by every visible sign to depart the island altogether. Mestre Vicente cautions everyone in your gully to wait at least 1 more full day before attempting any return to the harbor, in case the departure proves to be a feint meant to draw frightened residents back down into the open, and the wait stretches long and tense, no one quite trusting the silence that has finally settled over the valley below. On the morning of the 10th day, word finally comes that the last of the English ships have weighed anchor and turned westward, their sails shrinking against the horizon until they vanish entirely into the same blue distance from which they first appeared, and the town, slowly, cautiously, begins its long walk back down out of the hills. You and your mother descend together, her hand in yours now rather than gripping your sleeve, both of you moving slowly on legs weakened by 10 days of poor food and constant fear, and the closer you come to the harbor, the more the smell reaches you first, ash and char and something underneath it, scorched stone and burned timber that will not fully clear from this valley's air for weeks to come. You have smelled smoke before. You have never smelled an entire town's memory burning at once. The streets you walk through no longer resemble the streets you fled 10 days earlier. Roofs have collapsed inward, leaving blackened beams jutting up like broken ribs. Doorways stand open onto rooms gutted down to bare stone, whatever furniture or stores they once held reduced to ash and char scattered across the floor. The white pillar in the square still stands, untouched somehow amid everything around it, and you find yourself staring at it longer than you expect to. This single object built to punish people exactly like the ones whose absence allowed this entire town to be stripped and burned in the first place, surviving intact while everything built by free hands around it has fallen. You and your mother continue toward the harbor, past the cathedral, and you stop there longest of all, because the bell tower, the one you have heard ring out over this town every morning of your entire life, stands empty now, its bronze bells gone entirely, carried away to whatever ship will eventually deliver them to a foreign foundry or a foreign church, melted down or repurposed into something this town will never see or hear again. You did not expect silence to have a sound of its own. It does. You will hear it in this square for the rest of your life. You make your way, finally, to where the customs house once stood, and you find only a portion of its outer walls still upright, the roof entirely gone, the shelves that once held a century's worth of ledgers reduced to a heap of ash and curled, blackened paper that crumbles to nothing the moment you try to touch it. You stand in what was once the doorway, looking at the wreckage of the place where you spent the past 5 years of your life, learning a trade that taught you both your own steadiness and your own complicity in equal measure, and something in your chest finally breaks open, quietly, without drama, the way a dam gives way not in one dramatic collapse but in a slow, final yielding after days of pressure it could no longer hold. Mr. Vicente finds you there an hour later, having climbed up to retrieve the locked chest from its hiding place and carried it back down on his own aching shoulders, and he sets it down in front of you without a word. This single surviving record of 5 years' worth of ships, cargoes, and the people reduced to numbers within them, the only piece of this customs house's entire history that did not turn to ash. You look at that chest for a long moment, and you are no longer certain whether its survival feels like a mercy or simply one more thing this town's machinery managed to save while everything else around it burned. You walk down toward the wharf itself that same afternoon, drawn there almost against your own will, and find the stone quay scarred with scorch marks where something flammable was set alight close to the water's edge. The bollards you once stood beside on your very first morning here blackened but still standing, stubborn iron and stone refusing to give way entirely even as everything built around them did. The 7 slaving ships that once rode at anchor in this harbor are gone now, taken by the English fleet along with whatever else they judged worth the carrying, and the half-built caravel from the shipyard has vanished as well, dismantled timber by timber and loaded aboard ships now far out across the Atlantic. The years of careful labor that went into building it, scattered into pieces you will likely never see assembled again. Other families move through the ruins around you that same afternoon, picking through what remains of their own homes and shops, the sound of quiet weeping carrying across the square more than once, mixed with the occasional sharper cry of someone finding, beneath the ash, some small object that survived against all expectation, a piece of crockery, a child's toy, a single page of scripture spared by whatever wind carried the flames in one direction rather than another. You help an elderly neighbor clear debris from her doorway before you finally walk home yourself, your hands blackened with soot by the time you reach your own street, and you find your house, like Signora Filipa's shop, spared the worst of the destruction, close enough to the edge of town that the fire never fully reached it. though every window has been broken and the door hangs loose on a single remaining hinge. You stand in your own doorway for a long time that evening before finally going inside, as though crossing the threshold too quickly might somehow undo the small mercy of finding it still standing at all. In the days that follow, the town begins, slowly and unevenly, the long work of rebuilding, families returning to whatever remains of their homes, merchants assessing what little inventory survived, the governor eventually returning from his hiding place to resume an authority that feels, to everyone who lived through these 10 days, considerably smaller than it did before. You learn in the weeks after that the slave hospital near the seasoning compound was largely spared the worst of the burning, the English having apparently found little worth taking from a building full of the sick and dying, and that most of the captives confined there survived the raid, a small, strange mercy buried inside an event that offered almost no mercy anywhere else. You think of this often in the months that follow, the way an entire town built on the suffering of people exactly like those patients was itself stripped and humbled by an outside force, while the very people that machinery had been grinding down for over a century emerged from the same event largely untouched, as though history itself had decided for once to spare the ones everyone else had already given up on. Senora Filipa's shop survived with only minor damage, near enough the edge of town to escape the worst of the burning, and you find yourself sitting in her doorway again within the month, the cool shade unchanged even as everything around it has not been. She tells you, watching you carefully the way she always has, that she does not believe this town will ever quite return to what it was before, that something has shifted in its foundations that no amount of rebuilding will fully repair, and you find, listening to her, that you agree with her more completely than you expected to. Duarte's family workshop, closer to the heart of the destruction, will take far longer to rebuild, and you spend several evenings that winter helping him clear debris and salvage what timber can still be used, the two of you working in a silence that says more than either of you could manage in words. The rope and canvas his father spent years accumulating turn out to be a near total loss, charred beyond use, though the workshop's stone walls themselves survived well enough to be rebuilt around. And Duarte's father declares, the day the new roof beams go up, that he intends to die in this same spot regardless of what any fleet from any nation ever does to it again. You think of your own conversation with Duarte in the hills, about ground a man does not abandon, and you understand that his father's stubbornness and your own quiet decision to stay and rebuild come from exactly the same place, a loyalty to this small, dry island that neither of you has ever fully been able to explain in words. Some friendships, you learn, grow stronger in exactly this kind of silence. 2 years after the raid, word reaches the customs house that the Crown in Lisbon has finally authorized funds for a proper stone fortress to be built on the hill above the harbor, something the town's defenders have requested for years without success. And you watch, over the seasons that follow, as masons and laborers slowly raise walls thick enough, this time to actually withstand cannon fire rather than simply look imposing from a passing ship. You climb up to watch the construction sometimes on quiet evenings, the new walls rising stone by stone where 10 days of fire and theft once taught this entire town exactly what its old defenses were truly worth. And you find yourself thinking more than once that a lesson learned this expensively should perhaps have been learned through wisdom instead, though wisdom, you have come to understand, rarely moves a crown to spend money the way fear does. The harbor trade itself never quite recovers the volume it carried before the raid. Ships choosing other ports along this same coast more often than they once did. Merchants like Senor Vaz quietly shifting more of their business toward towns further along the African coast that suffered no such reckoning. And you record this slow drift in your ledgers year after year, watching the columns shrink the way you once watched them swell during your earliest years at this desk. You return to work at the customs house once it has been rebuilt enough to function again. The new building smaller and plainer than the one that stood there before, and you find that your hand, when you finally pick up a quill again, no longer moves with quite the same steady confidence it once carried. Mestre Vicente notices this too, watching you work through your first weeks back, and tells you one evening, in a voice quieter than his usual flatness, that perhaps some unsteadiness is not entirely a flaw in a man doing the kind of work the two of you do, that perhaps a hand too steady for too long was never something to be especially proud of in the first place. You ask him, that same evening, whether he ever thinks about the people whose names passed through his own hands over the years, the categories, the prices, the careful arithmetic of human worth he taught you so thoroughly during your first months here. He is quiet for a long moment before answering, and when he finally speaks, his voice carries a weight you have never heard in it before, telling you that he thinks of little else most nights, and that the fire which took this town's wealth in 10 short days took something from him as well, that he suspects will never fully return. A certain comfortable distance he had spent years building between his hand and the lives that hand once recorded. Something shifts between you in that admission. The two of you have become something closer to equals in your shared discomfort than you ever were as master and apprentice. You think about Aisatu sometimes still, on quiet evenings, wondering where the years have carried her, whether the careful, mapping attention she once turned on this town ever served her the way you hoped it might, though you will never have any way of knowing for certain. You wonder, too, whether she ever learned what became of the town that once counted her onto its wharf, whether news of its burning ever reached wherever she ended up, and whether, if it did, any part of her felt something like the strange, complicated relief you yourself have struggled to name ever since. You think, too, about the chest of ledgers Mestre Vicente carried down from the hills, sitting now in a new locked cabinet in the rebuilt customs house, the only surviving record of years you can never undo, and you understand that you will carry the weight of what those pages represent for the rest of your working life. Ship after ship, name after name, converted into numbers by your own steady hand. The harbor slowly fills again with ships, the trade resuming with the same grim persistence that has carried this town for over a century. Because a wound, you are learning, does not stop the machinery that caused it. It only teaches the people inside that machinery something about what they are truly part of. Your mother lives several more years past that autumn, her health holding steady longer than the physician once feared, and you spend many quiet evenings with her in the rebuilt house your father once raised from nothing. The two of you speaking less often than you once did about the wharf, the categories, the work that fills your days, because some things you have both learned are better carried in silence than spoken aloud. She tells you once, in one of her last clear winters, that she is proud of you, not for the work itself, which she has never fully understood, but for the steadiness with which you carried this family through 10 days that broke far stronger men than you completely. You hold those words longer than almost anything else she ever gave you. The town never quite becomes what it once was. A real fortress rises eventually on the hill above the harbor, built years too late to have saved anything during those 10 days. A stone reminder standing watch over a wound it arrived far too late to prevent. You grow older in this town, your hand finding its old steadiness again over time, though something underneath that steadiness has changed permanently, a knowledge carried quietly the way Senora Filippa once told you survival itself must be carried, narrow, careful, never entirely clean. The bell that once called this town to prayer rings again eventually. A new bell, smaller than the ones carried away, its voice slightly different, but close enough that most residents stop noticing the difference within a year or two. You notice it every single time. The nights grow quieter as the years settle over this harbor, the wharf returning to its old rhythms, ships arriving, cargoes counted, the same patient ocean carrying the same patient trade it has carried for over a century before you and will carry for years after you are gone. You walk home some evenings along the harbor wall, past the rebuilt warehouses, past the white pillar that survived everything this town has endured, and you watch the last light pull off the water and sink behind the western hills, the same quiet hand that has closed over this island every evening of your life. The work continues. The ledgers fill again, slowly, page by careful page. And somewhere beneath all of it, quiet now, settled, the weight you have carried since you were 19 years old finally rests, not gone, never gone. Only carried, the way you have learned to carry everything else this town ever asked of you. This has been a story from Quiet History at Bedtime. If tonight's story kept you company, a like and a subscribe help this channel keep telling stories like it. Turn on notifications if you would like to know when the next one arrives, and let your eyes close now whenever they are ready. Good night. Sleep well.